Good morning, everybody. Today's session is on soils and fertilizers. I'm going to actually hand it right over to John, who will be instructing today's course. I'll be on standby if you guys need anything. At the end, John will be answering some questions. Please email me. I will drop my email in the chat if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint at the end. All right, John, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Good morning, folks. And this is a presentation about the soils and fertilizers. Because if you have healthy soil, you can probably grow most plants quite easily. So we'll jump right into it, and we'll talk a little bit about fertilizers. Some of this you may know, but it's very good information. Whenever you buy a bag of fertilizer, legally there has to be 3 numbers on the front, even if one of those numbers is 0. So, and they are always in order. And the first one is nitrogen, then phosphorus and potassium, what we call the NPK. So a box of or bag of 10, 10, 10 would have 10% of each of those elements. Those are the primary nutrients. The next set of nutrients, we'll just call them the secondary nutrients. Those don't have to be on the front of the bag, but on the back of the bag, if any of those elements are in there, then they will be listed. And these are very important nutrients also. Quite often for a lawn, for instance, you might get a fertilizer that is just very heavy in the first number and not so much on the next 2. And that's because a lawn is mostly green. It doesn't need to flower or reproduce. So the nitrogen would be the important element there. So the nitrogen promotes the vegetative growth, and it gives plants their green color. So if you don't give your plants nitrogen, or if they don't get enough of it, you'll generally get stunted growth and just an overall pallor or loss of color. Okay. There are different types of nitrogen. They all have to break down to the nitrate form before they can be used. Okay. So some forms of nitrogen require bacteria to break them down and a soil temperature of at least 45 degrees. For instance, organic fertilizers. So they don't work when it's cold at all. They have to have warm weather to activate the bacteria, which would then break down the fertilizer and bring it to the plants. So if you have organic nitrogen, as you can see, it has to break down several forms before it can be used by the plant. You can buy fertilizers that have ammonia nitrogen in them, and they're already 1 step broken down. And then you can find some that have nitrites, which are 2 steps broken down. So calcium nitrate, which used to be readily available, is not necessarily available anymore. A lot of the very strong fertilizers have been taken off the market since the Oklahoma City bombing. But calcium nitrate was a great one because it was already in the nitrate form, so it could break down in the winter. Now, ammonium sulfate, which is good in the, we'll call it late winter, early spring, and late fall, early winter, it needs some bacterial action, but not nearly as much as the organics. Urea, that's used in a lot of fertilizers. It's a very strong source of nitrogen and shouldn't be used too terribly often. Blood meal is a an effective form of nitrogen during the warm months. It's also one of the strongest sources of nitrogen that you can get organically. I've seen blood meal as high as 13, maybe even 15% nitrogen, which is very high for organics. Okay, the second number on the bag is the phosphorus, and we'll need that for root development and flower and fruit formation. Some people that grow flowers and fruit trees make sure that they give their plants a pretty good dose of phosphorus early in the season. I know that the Rose Society loves to give their roses a little shot of superphosphate, which is a high concentration of phosphorus, late winter, because it takes a little bit for the phosphorus to get down to the roots, break down, and work on the plant. Okay. So quite often, a sign of deficiency would be little or no flower or fruit development. If, in the case of a rose or a fruit tree, if you're not getting good flower and fruit development, the first thing I would check is sunlight. The roses and fruit trees need sunlight all day long, from morning till night. And sunlight is what really causes the tree to want to produce flowers and fruits. So if it's getting plenty of sunlight, then I would feed them with phosphorus at least once a year and early in the season. Okay. Because as you see right there, it can take several months to show results. So if we use it early enough, that'd be great. You could even use it in the fall, late fall, say October, before the plants shut down, and then the phosphorus would be available to them in early spring. So bone meal would be an organic source of phosphorus. And it really needs to be in direct contact. So it could be added to the soil at the time of planting. When you're planting your roses or your fruit trees or your vegetables, put some bone meal in there or something, an organic fertilizer that contains bone meal. And by working it into the soil, it'll make contact with the roots much sooner. Now, superphosphate, that's a product I mentioned for roses. It's more water soluble than bone meal. So when it gets wet, it begins to break down. Then diammonium phosphate is something that you might find in water soluble fertilizers. These would be things like perhaps blooming types. Growmore makes a number of like super bloom and high bloom. Anything that's got a high concentration of phosphorus will probably have a source of phosphorus that's water soluble. And then potassium, that's the last of the three numbers, and it's needed to produce the starches and sugars that allow a plant to grow. It also helps to balance the plant's use of nitrogen and phosphorus. And once again, apply it in early spring, and it'll help to reduce stress on maples, magnolias, dogwoods, and acid-loving plants. Potassium can be applied to plants that are native to Australia, for instance, because Australian natives don't like phosphorus. So there are foods available that have high concentrations of potassium and little or no phosphorus. Hibiscus is a good example of a plant that doesn't like phosphorus, but loves potassium. Okay. And these are just the various carriers that you'd find if you read the back of the bag very closely. And the potassium sulfate is the one that is great for plants like the Australian native, and hibiscus, and other flowering plants too, but particularly where you don't necessarily want to add phosphorus to the soil. And potassium nitrate is available in, like, we'll call them orchid foods, house plant foods, flowering plant foods. Now, after we hit the secondary nutrients, then we go to the micronutrients. And there's a number of them, and some of them are very important. That's why when you look on the back of the bag of your fertilizer, make sure that aside from just the N, P, and K, that maybe you've got some iron in there, and some magnesium, um, and some sulfur. Because sometimes if our soil is out of whack because of the pH, the addition of sulfur will help to release uh, some of the available magnesium and iron. So our soils are a little bit higher than 7. 7.2, I believe, is neutral. So if your soil starts to get to about 7.5, might be a good time to add a little sulfur to decrease the pH level, and then the various nutrients should be available. Okay, so here's what happens when the plants don't get those little micronutrients. You see the yellowing in between the veins on the liquid amber leaf. And then on the other slide, that one would be a nitrogen deficiency because all of the leaf is yellow, not just in between the veins. So that's a real good difference there between a nitrogen deficiency and a iron deficiency. Okay. So we mentioned the roses and the Rose Society, and they like to feed the roses with something pretty much every month. Now they do switch ingredients. They might use a liquid fish emulsion one week. They might use alfalfa meal the next, etc. You want to be careful not to overdo the fertilization. Plants can only take up so much food at any one time, and the rest is either wasted or it can actually cause problems. Burning would be a typical problem of overfeeding. If you apply a general balanced fertilizer once a year, and if that fertilizer has everything we've discussed so far, then you're probably not going to have a nutrient deficiency. They're not as common as you might think. And other than what we've just shown you regarding the nitrogen and the iron, it would be difficult to really confirm a deficiency, short of doing a very expensive lab test. And that's why I think that if you simply gave all your plants a balanced food, then you would know that all the nutrients have been applied. So here we go. Now we're going to talk about the fertilizer label. And as I mentioned to you, they've got to have all 3 of those numbers. And in order to be called a fertilizer, the sum of those numbers must equal 5. So, for instance, you see here that this would be called a 10-6-4 fertilizer. 10% nitrogen, 6% phosphorus, 4% potassium, and the total would be 20. So that's a very strong fertilizer. And on the back of the bag, it will tell you where those sources of nitrogen came from. And with what we've just discussed, you'll now know what percentage of that nitrogen is readily available, how much will be tied up or left in the soil for a longer period of time. So that's why reading the label will answer a lot of questions about how fast does this work and how long does it last. You'll see that there's 2% organic nitrogen from the blood meal, and we know that the blood meal is going to break down slower than the calcium nitrate. So this particular label shows us that we have fast-acting and slow-acting sources of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. So these are just some basic rules. Apply when the soil is moist, but the foliage is dry. So if you watered the day before, that's fine. If you can't avoid getting fertilizer on the leaves, on the foliage, then wash it off immediately. Just wash it off, get it off the leaves down into the ground, and then water it in. Throwing fertilizers around on the ground without watering them in would be very wasteful because the fertilizers don't work. Most granular fertilizers don't work until you get them wet, and then the nutrients are released. And don't use the same fertilizer all year round. Alternate. There might be different ingredients in different fertilizers. Okay, and fertilize with moderate rates. Smaller doses of food would be better than a heavy dose once a year. So liquid fertilizers are going to be available immediately to the plant. So anything that is water soluble, that either starts liquid or that you mix with water, will go to work quickly. If you need fast results from your plants, use water soluble. They don't last long, but quick results. Then there's granular fertilizers, and there's different types. There are fast release fertilizers that as soon as you water them, they'll break down and feed your plant. Then there's slow release granular fertilizers, and these produce or release food to the plants for a long period of time, some of them for a full year. Some granular slow release fertilizers can be added to the soil, and they'll take care of feeding for the entire season. Not a great idea on turf, but perhaps very good for flowers and shrubs and even potted plants. Okay, so Osmocote right there is one of those slow release fertilizers that release for a very long period of time. So if you're the sort that don't think you'll be getting out there to water very often, perhaps use the Osmocote. It can be mixed into the ground at the time of planting. It can be used on top, but it's best if it's raked in or mixed in. And then every time you water, a little bit more will be broken down. Agriform is a industrial form of nitrogen, sometimes used by gardeners or landscapers. And it will release, depends on the amount of bacteria and the size of the particles. So typically you get a quick release and a slow release. And IBDU, that's another slow release fertilizer that may be available in certain products. Okay, so that's it for fertilizer. And remember, if you have any questions at all during the course of this class, you can type them into the Q&A box there. For instance, if you have any, if I failed to mention something about fertilizers, go ahead and jot it down now. And at the end, I will answer them, okay? Because we're going to switch to soils now. And the soils are a little more complicated than just fertilizers, because without soil, we can't grow our plants. They support the roots, they hold the water, and they hold the minerals. They hold oxygen and those bacteria that we've been talking about. There's various forms of bacteria and fungus in the soil that we absolutely need, and they help to break down organic material and fertilizers and make it available for the plants. So typically, soils are broke down according to the size. So you've probably heard of sandy soils, clay soils, and perhaps loam soils. So a sandy soil would have a higher percentage of sand than any other type of soil. Clay soil, just the opposite, higher percentage of clay. A loam soil has a good combination of both. So a loam soil would be a wonderful thing to have. I've been blessed with a loamy soil and everything does just great in there. So loam contains sand, silt, and clay, but no one type dominates. It would be great if your clay percentage was about 10%, but even up to 30% is workable. Soil containing more than 20% clay is considered a clay soil, and certainly once you hit the 30% or higher mark, then it becomes more difficult to work with, okay? Now, two advantages of clay soils. One is they usually contain more minerals because they are in fact broken down further. The particles are broken down smaller than other types of soil, meaning they contain more minerals and they can hold on to these minerals for a longer period of time. Clay also holds moisture. If you have a high percentage of clay in your soil, you can water less often because it holds the moisture. It might take a little longer to get the water to soak in, but when it does, it lasts a very long time. So clay soils, there are advantages to it. There's usually more organic matter and bacterial activity as opposed to a sandy soil. Sandy soils don't have a whole lot going on. So desirable qualities of soil amendments. We're going to talk now about soil amendments. This would be improving your soil if you had a clay soil or a silt or a sandy soil. These would be things that you could add to them to change the soil. And most soil amendments are going to be free of pests and weeds, and they're going to break down slowly, and they're going to, some of them contain some nitrogen, and if not, they can hold on to the nitrogen once you apply it. Readily available in consistent quantity and quality. Generally inexpensive. It will improve the drainage and aeration and improve the water and nutrient retention. And that line right there is very important. If you have a sandy soil or a less than desirable quality soil, the addition of soil amendments can help to improve the water and nutrient retention. Can also change the pH if needed and increases the beneficial soil microorganisms because it gives them a place to live and something to eat. These microorganisms love to eat the organic material, and then they can multiply, and in so doing, break down nutrients, make them available to our plants. So there are various types of soil amendments. Most have a base of wood. That is the base ingredient in almost every soil amendment. They're either made from wood shavings or the bark. They're usually composted. In fact, I would say that pretty much all of them on the market are wood products that have been composted. And what that means is that they've been broken down and they won't deplete nitrogen from your soil. If you're going to use wood chips, straight wood chips that have not been composted, then they might take some nitrogen from the soil. That's why when we talk about mulching and using wood chips, we don't put them up next to our plants. We put them out around the perimeter to keep the soil moist to draw the roots out away. We don't pile our mulch products, our wood products, up next to the trunks of the trees or shrubs or plants. Okay. So if you look at the back of the bag of the amendment, usually the number one product will be some form of wood product. It might say composted forest products. And of course, forest is trees. So it would be composted tree products. And as I mentioned, that could be either the bark, which is very high quality, or just broken down wood. I know, for instance, the orchids and the orchid mixes, they all use bark, fir bark, to grow in, and it's quite healthy for them. Then another ingredient that you might find in your soil amendments is peat moss. And peat moss, once it gets wet, it stays wet. So it increases the water holding capability of the soil, also holds the nutrients in well too. For some plants that need a low pH, like azaleas and camellias and fuchsias, peat moss is very important because it helps to keep the pH levels where the plants need it. It's typically more expensive, so generally it's going to be a smaller percentage of the actual planting mix, but it can also be bought straight if need be, or if you buy a planting mix for acid-loving plants, it will be one of the main ingredients in there. Now, steer manure is another ingredient, but you won't find it in any of the soil amendments. Steer manure is typically sold by itself, and that's typically all that would be in the bag is steer manure. And some people like to top dress their lawn, maybe even the roses or their fruit trees once a year with steer manure. We don't recommend doing it too often because typically it is high in salts and the food value isn't that great. So over the years, steer manure has kind of lost favor among gardeners. Now, in potting soils, these would be amendments that you would buy. They will be called potting soils. They're for use in pots, and they're pre-mixed, and they have to have a lot of different ingredients in them in order to allow for proper drainage, as well as oxygen retention and moisture retention. So perlite, sometimes called sponge rock, is available by itself. You can buy it yourself if you're mixing amendments or potting soils. It's also found in many high quality potting soil mixes. Vermiculite is another one. You can purchase that oven by itself, or it may be an ingredient in some potting soil mixes. And vermiculite, and these are organic materials, certainly. Vermiculite holds large concentrations of water and nutrients without affecting the pH. You may recall on the previous slide that I mentioned that peat moss will do those things, but it also changes or affects the pH. So, preparing soil for planting is very important. If you prepare the soil properly at the beginning of the season, you really won't have to do much more than pull weeds and water the rest of the year. I have found that in preparing the soil for a vegetable garden or strawberry bed, even flower gardens, that if you work in the organic material and fertilizers, typically organic fertilizers, because they won't burn. If you work them into your soil, you can plant right away, and there may be enough nutrition in there then to feed the plants for the rest of the season. So this is just a real quick 9-step formula to take let's say an old area where you used to grow lawn, but because of the drought, you couldn't grow lawn, but you wanted to grow vegetables. Well, following these steps, you could turn that soil over and change what used to be a piece of lawn in the front yard or backyard into a actively growing vegetable garden. And by the way, we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the class, but watering vegetables or fruit trees is okay. It's not covered by the guidelines for regular watering, but we'll discuss that more. So you might consider converting a portion of a lawn area or another area that has high water needs to fruit trees or vegetable gardens, because you'll actually use less water and won't be under the restrictions. Now, step 5 on the previous slide was adding the addition of organic material and fertilizers to the soil. So this is a list of some of those items. You'll see gypsum on there and lime. The addition of the equal amounts of gypsum and lime to your soil will sweeten your soil or correct the pH of the soil. Epsom salts contains large amounts of magnesium and sulfur, which is great for the soil. And then our rock phosphate or bone meal will take care of our phosphorus needs. And green sand or sulfomag will take care of our sulfur needs, potassium needs, and magnesium needs. So the addition of these things into the ground that you're preparing for your soil, I have found that if I do this, work it all into the soil and plant, I don't have to feed my plants again during the season. Now, if you're planting an individual plant or a fruit tree, you can use one of the bagged soil amendments, and then to that, you can add some individual supplements in the hole that you're preparing for your individual plant, your rose, your shrub, or your fruit tree. And these products are readily available, and some of them are the same products that we would be using in the vegetable garden. For instance, the gypsum and the magnesium sulfate and the natural fertilizer. And keep in mind, when you're adding fertilizers, make sure that they contain the beneficial bacteria, the fungus, and the humic acids. Those 3 things are what helps to break down the soil and the fertilizers to release them to your plant. So healthy amounts of beneficial bacteria, mycorrhizae fungus, and humic acids, good quantities of those in your soil, and your plants will thrive. So if you were interested in creating your own organic soil for use in a container, in a raised bed, square foot gardening, or anything of that sort, then copy this slide down. And this is the base. And we've talked about some of these products already. We talked about peat moss. Well, coconut coir is a good substitute for peat moss. We talked about organic materials, organic compost. These would be the fir bark and other wooden products that are broken down. And then there's our vermiculite for moisture retention. And then sand and pumice, which would be for adequate drainage. So that would be our base material. We'd basically be creating our own soil with this mixture. But then to that, of course, we have to add things, minerals especially. And here's our gypsum and lime again, our rock phosphate, and our 5 pounds of the organic fertilizer. In other words, all those products that we talked about on the previous slide there, the peat moss, coconut, compost, these don't have any living materials in them. They don't contain any of the necessary bacteria and fungus and humic acids that are needed. So by adding the organic fertilizer and these minerals to our soil, then we will have all of these good guys in there, our beneficial bacteria, our mycorrhizae fungus. They'll all be there in the soil and help to break things down to feed your plants over a long period of time. Okay, so that's going to be the end of our soil discussion. And what we're going to talk about now is the new guidelines that hopefully you're all aware of from the Water District. As you are certainly well aware, we are in the middle of a terrible drought. We've had these droughts before, and we've had to make changes to our lifestyle. And one of those changes is in how we water in the yard. Typically for most residents of Santa Clarita, outdoor watering comprises 60 to 80% of the water use. So showers, and toilets, and washing machines, they use maybe 40% of the water that you're using totally. The rest is in outdoor watering. So cuts that can be made to your outdoor watering are going to have the biggest benefit. So with that being said, here is the watering update, and this began June 1st. And we are in what's called stage 2 contingency plan. And with any luck, we don't have to go to stage 3, but stage 2 means we're allowed to water 3 times a week. And many of you know that the Department of Water and Power in the valley and other areas have limited their customers to 1 day a week for outdoor watering. So we're very fortunate to be able to water 3 times a week. We should be able to keep everything doing just fine. I know that I've never watered my trees or shrubs more than once a week, so they thrive. So 3 times a week should be fine. Now, as I mentioned, there would be some exceptions to that basic rule. And one would be the use of the high efficiency sprinkler nozzles. The sprinkler nozzles that are high efficiency usually put the water out in streams, and it may take longer to get the same amount of water out. So that's why there's no restrictions on your watering days. You can water more than the 5 or 10 minutes that they recommend, because quite often these high efficiency nozzles need to run for 20 minutes. Drip irrigation, same thing. I run my drip irrigation once a week for 1 hour, because it takes an hour to get enough water out of drip irrigation to water the plants thoroughly. Next, there's no restrictions on hand watering. So on the days that you're allowed to water, you can grab the garden hose as long as it has a shutoff on it and go out and water your vegetable garden or your fruit trees or whatever you think, maybe your little flowers, whatever you think needs additional watering, okay? And then of course, you can't wash off your driveway or sidewalks and avoid runoff when you are watering. This water is precious stuff and there's a finite amount of it. So we don't want to be wasting it and watching it run down the gutter. Okay, now we're going to go to a Q&A section. And if you have any questions at all about anything that I've talked about, now would be the time to ask them. Okay. Okay.
John, do you want me
So,
to assist you by asking you the questions?
yeah, let me see if I've got them here. And if I make a mistake reading them, please correct me. It looks like I have one here. It says, it's to you and they'd like you to send a PDF to them. Okay. And I'm sure Laura will do that. And then what's your opinion about the use of fertilizer spikes for trees and shrubs? I don't use them. I don't think they're a very good way to fertilize things because they only put the fertilizer in certain locations, basically wherever you put the spike in the ground. The spikes are concentrated forms of fertilizer, and to push them down into a root or into one section of a plant, it doesn't feed the entire plant equally. So I don't use them. I don't recommend them. I think it's better to distribute the fertilizer evenly around the entire root system. Next, does it make sense to apply fertilizer only at the point where drip system drippers are located in order to, oh, well, okay, good question here. And what they're asking about is applying fertilizer when you have a drip system. Well, you've got to get out with the garden hose. The drip systems are not effective at watering the fertilizers into the ground. They're not. That is perhaps a drawback of them. So after you apply fertilizer, you will need to go out with the garden hose and water them in. The drip system just won't do it. Okay, the next question is for those with clay soil, what type of mulch would you recommend to help with the water restrictions? Any type at all, any mulches, there's myriad varieties. I've never met one I didn't like. There are some very attractive looking ones. There's one, for instance, called gorilla hair. Would you like to have that job, to go to the zoo at night when the gorilla is sleeping? And anyway, the gorilla hair is very nice. It's made from shredded redwood, actually, and it looks very attractive. Now, there's also shredded cedar that is very nice. And if you like finer mulches, there's things like grow mulch that are very fine and very dark and look nice when you apply them around your plants. Can we get these slides as reference handout? I can't make notes as fast as he can cover the material. Yes. And also keep in mind that this program is recorded. You can go back at any time you'd like and click on a slide or click on a presentation that I've given and get this material. And then also you can email Laura and she can see about perhaps emailing you over a particular slide or a PDF. Okay. Do we need to fertilize drought tolerant shrubs? Native plants don't need fertilizing. Most drought tolerant plants don't need fertilizing. And some plants really don't like to be fed at all. I'll name you a few common plants that you may have that don't need or want to be fed. Lavender, sage, rosemary. Those three plants do quite well in full sun, lots of heat, infrequent watering, and no feeding. Beautiful plants, and they need very little care. Okay. And then Laura suggests to everybody that if you want a email copy of the PowerPoint, just let her know and she'll send it out to you. You need to replace mulch every year, rake it up and then reapply. You don't ever have to rake it up. Mulch does tend to decompose over time, and you may have to add some more on top of it. But allow it to do that. Allow it to break down because it will then provide a source of food for those little microorganisms and the bacteria, etc. So you will have to reapply the mulch as it breaks down, but you don't have to rake it up and get rid of it. It's actually not a bad thing to allow it to break down and then put more on top of it. Okay, let's see if there's any more questions up here. How many times to apply fertilizer and best time to apply it on grass lawns? Most people feed about 4 times a year. You can skip the dead of summer, feeding in early winter, in late winter, and again in the spring, and again in the fall. Should be sufficient. The feeding is of most importance, believe it or not, during the cool months because it's harder to keep the grass green in the cool months. Okay, next question is, where can you purchase all the material to make your own soil? Well, I happen to know of a very good nursery down in Santa Clarita. I think the address is 23734 Newhall Avenue. It's on Newhall Avenue between Lyons Avenue and the 14 freeway. And I have seen all of those products available there. Okay, and let's see if we've gotten them all. Let's see. Go. You put coffee grounds directly on the soil for rose bushes. Yeah, it's a wonderful idea. In fact, I know folks that actually will go to a Starbucks or other coffee place and ask them for their used coffee grounds. You can just put them right on the ground around the roses and other plants. You don't have to work them in, and they're great. They'll stimulate your roses, but not in a bad way. So yes, I would strongly suggest that you put coffee grounds. They're also good around azaleas and camellias. In fact, they're probably good around most plants, but particularly azaleas, camellias, roses, and acid-loving plants. Okay. What is the cause of grass turning brown? Some spots. 100 things. I'm often surprised when grass is green. Grass can turn brown from overwatering and underwatering, from fertilizer burn, from dog urine, rabbit urine. There's just so many reasons why. It's best to have somebody take a look at it or bring in pictures to your local nursery and have them diagnose it. Okay, can you share thoughts on mixing plants with different fertilizer requirements in the same planting bed? Well, in that case, I would probably just use an all-purpose and feed everything. There aren't too many plants that have very specific needs. I did mention that Australian natives and hibiscus, kangaroo paws, some of those plants don't like phosphorus. So you would have to be careful when feeding those plants if you're going to put them in with other shrubs. Yes, that would make it a little more difficult, but hopefully you can do that. Okay, let's see. Did we get care of everything? Okay, folks, I think I've answered all your questions. I'll be online for another couple of minutes here. If there's anything else that you would like to ask, let's see here. I mentioned sage and rosemary. The third plant that I mentioned that you didn't need to feed was lavender. And these are real common plants, great plants. Every house should grow these plants. They're drought tolerant. They love the sun and the heat. They don't get many problems at all. And you don't have to worry about feeding them. So excellent plants, excellent plants. Okay, I think I've gotten them all. And nobody has any questions about the new water requirements. That is great news. Hopefully you've received information from the water agency about this, but if not, you can email us and we'll certainly help you out. Okay, and thank you all. Thank you all for putting up with me for the presentation. And I think we have another one coming up next month, don't we, Laura?
Yeah, our next class will be July 9th, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. And it'll be on controlling weeds, pests, and diseases. So that'll be a great follow-up to this class.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then I guess, Laura, there's a few people that wanted you to send them PDFs or something. Other than that, I think we did great. Folks, thank you for listening. And Laura, thank you for your assistance. And I will see you July 9th.
Perfect. Bye, John. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.